Good morning. I'm Raymond Ramcharita, Corporate Communications Manager of the Anthony and Sabga Caribbean Awards for Excellence. And this morning, we're speaking to two of our laureates, Professor Caryl Phillips of St. Kitts Nevis and the UK, and Professor Anselm Hennis, Barbados. These gentlemen have been presented the awards for 2013 in Arts and Letters and Science and Technology. Good morning, Professor Phillips. Welcome back to the Caribbean.
Good morning.
You are one of the Caribbean's eminent novelists. You have won the Commonwealth Prize in 2004. You've written 10 novels, edited 2 collections, published 5 collections of essays. So you are one of our eminent writers. You're back for this award. Could you tell us how does it feel to be recognized in the place of your birth and to the place, in the place that you've dedicated so much of your career?
Well, it always feels good to be recognized, I think. It's also, I think, important to be recognized in the place that really is the cradle of what I think of for a writer, one's anxieties, one's concerns. I mean, writers write out of a sense of concern for a specific set of problems, a specific set of people, if you like. And my parents, my grandparents, came from various parts of the globe to the Caribbean, and I then left the Caribbean to go to another part of the world. So in a sense, this is the nexus, this is the fulcrum around which my world has always revolved. So to be recognized here is wonderful.
Now, you've said in your writing that, and in an interview, that the Caribbean has a lot to teach the metropole.
Yeah.
Could you expand on that a little bit for us?
Well, I think a lot of the time, a lot of my life has been spent in Britain and in the United States of America, 2 countries that are struggling in various ways to come to terms with what might be called a multicultural or a multiracial society. The same is true, obviously, in Canada and many parts of the world who are passing legislation, various, sometimes clumsy governmental initiatives to try and make people get on with each other. One looks at the Caribbean, where people from Africa, people from Europe, people from Asia came together and had to find a way over the years to coexist, not always harmoniously, but I think the model of coexistence and the model of peaceably living together and respecting cultural difference is much better in the Caribbean without legislation than it is in many parts of the world.
Thank you, Professor Phillips. Professor Anselm Hennis, Director of the Chronic Disease Research Center in Barbados.
Morning.
Professor Hennis, your great achievement, and it's one that I am in awe of, is that you have established a career in research into epidemiology and medical issues in the CDRC. Before Professor Hennis went to Barbados, having qualified as an epidemiologist, there were very few career paths for researchers. Professor Hennis has managed to take the Chronic Disease Research Center of the University of the West Indies and transform it into an institution that collects data on many chronic diseases, stroke, diabetes, obesity, and it is now seen as a model for the region and the world. This is an enormous achievement. So Professor Hennis, tell us a little bit about we know that when you first went back to Barbados, research was not looked at as a fruitful career path. You have changed that.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
In fact, I am actually here today as an awardee and a laureate because of the fact that others before me had a vision for what might be possible. And I think, to be very candid, I stand on other people's shoulders. They had a vision, they looked ahead over the horizon, and I was able to climb on top of their shoulders, see even beyond that, and actualize it. When I left the UK, and it actually was quite a decision, because I had completed my training as a clinician and as a researcher, and I was offered a job in the premier institution in the UK in this field. And I determined to go back to the Caribbean and try to make a difference there. When I arrived, there were expectations and hopes, but no clear strategy, no clear way forward. And so one had to start with very little in place and create a culture and an ethos. And I think success, in fact, does breed success. Over time, we're able to attract a cadre of some very committed, very high caliber scientists to the department. We've recruited people from all over the world who have come to CDRC, and we're doing work that's made its mark globally, regionally, and nationally. And in fact, just to share a few things with you, we've worked with a number of collaborators, particularly in the US in the last 2 decades. And we've been able, through work done with Stony Brook University, to establish the most significant study of eye diseases in the black population in the world. We've done work on prostate cancer, recruiting the largest cohort in the Caribbean to date, over 1,000 men with prostate cancer, etc.
One of the most important things you've done is the diabetic foot study, where you establish that women who wear high heels are actually at greatest risk for diabetic foot. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's quite interesting to me. We got some funding from the Wellcome Trust in the UK, and we looked at risk factors for amputation. And clearly, poor circulation to the feet as well as nerve damage are major risk factors. But we looked at other things which are intuitive. People wearing tight, high-heeled shoes, or men wearing pointed-toe leather shoes, or people going outside in the yard barefooted, are all risk factors. And we're able to prove that these increase the risk of amputations 3 times compared to those who wear proper footwear. These are obvious things, but it then sends the route forward for prevention. We also found in this particular study, we looked at the group 5 years on, and we found out that the highest rates of death after an amputation related to diabetes reported in the world to date was actually in our group in Barbados.
Okay.
Which are pretty awful statistics.
Okay.
But I think our figures are no different to the rest of the Caribbean, just that we documented it very comprehensively and carefully, and it has lessons for us to reduce the burden of amputations.
So this model is being spread through the Caribbean. CDRCs are coming up.
We actually have other groups now who are working similarly in terms of the same sort of principles of looking at risk factors for diabetic amputation. And in fact, we've brought into a program, the step-by-step program, which has now come to the region from international agencies, which are trying to train the trainers in terms of better practices.
Okay, thank you. Professor Phillips, you have been coming back and forth to the Caribbean for your entire career since the age of 22. Is there anything that you've seen in the Caribbean that's different, that gives you hope, anything in the way things are done, new writers? It's a broad question, but just pick one area and let me know.
Well, to be honest, I'm very pleased to see the emergence of new writers here. I mean, there is a practical problem because writers are dependent upon publishers. I know that in order to get published, one has had to traditionally navigate metropolitan centers of publishing, Britain, Toronto, New York. But the advent of self-publishing, the internet, the various ways of getting your work, getting your stories out to the audience, I think is going to benefit the Caribbean. The young writers that I've seen working at the university, particularly in Cave Hill in Barbados, they seem as hungry, as determined, as imaginative as a previous generation. But I feel more optimistic that they're not going to feel, perhaps, shall we say, as isolated sitting down here in the Caribbean hoping that they get a return phone call or something back in the mail from London.
Okay. Professor, tell me a little bit about the future in terms of policy and what governmental policy and what you're trying to do.
Yes, I think quite often research means you collect information. The next steps are to translate that information to practice and policy. We now have established with government in Barbados surveillance systems for the major cause of ill health and death in our country. That's heart attack, stroke, and cancer. And unless you're doing that, you have no idea in terms of how your interventions or your policies impact healthcare systems. And this is a problem across the region. Trinidad, for example, rated as the 3rd fattest country in the world. Trinidad has extremely high cardiovascular mortality rates and risks for cardiovascular disease here. And unless one is monitoring and seeing if your interventions are impacting risk factors and disease outcomes, you really are not going to make a difference. So we established a surveillance system which has been seen to be a model for the region. And we've had a lot of interest from NIH and from PAHO, etc., because we think it can work. And what we did, we merged surveillance of the 3 diseases, heart attack, stroke, and cancer, as one registry. So you actually don't have 3 times resources needed. You have a core set of resources, and then you build onto that. So I think it's a very interesting model that is useful. I think secondly, we're also trying to build health economics, particularly in collaboration with the groups here in Trinidad at the unit here, because I think it's important to know what your health costs are. Absolutely. And how to best spend your dollars. And I think clearly surveillance trying to get people to change behavior is really the major challenge that we have faced. But it's an ongoing process, and I think research is a key part of that process. And I think what I'd like to see is that Caribbean governments, which have already recognized the burden of non-communicable diseases, and as you know, they led the charge to have the United Nations high-level meeting in New York 2 years ago. Caribbean governments have to buy into the idea that they have to fund medical research and surveillance in the interests of their populations.
Thank you. Professor Anselm Hennis of the Chronic Disease Research Center in Barbados, Professor Caryl Phillips, now of Yale University, formerly of St. Kitts Nevis, and the United Kingdom. These gentlemen are both laureates in Science and Technology and Arts and Letters, respectively, of the Anthony and Sabga Caribbean Awards for Excellence program for 2013. You can find more information about the Anthony and Sabga Caribbean Awards for Excellence on YouTube, Facebook, and our website, www.answercaribbeanawards.com.